Hello, and welcome to another episode of History Hack, the most fabulous podcast on the entire net about history, crazy people who love history, and history. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I want to let you know a few things, though. We've got a brand new website, which you definitely need to check out. So find us there at www.historyhack.co.uk. There you'll find bios, info, fantastic merchandise up there, designed by our favorite Beardy Weirdo cartoonist, who I'd like to say has done a fabulous Beardy Weirdy cartoon of yours truly. Thanks so much for tuning into another episode. We are always happy to have you listen to us in all of our nerdy glory. If you like us, you can show your appreciation by giving us a 5-star super shiny sparkly review on Apple, so more people will see us on their podcast feeds and listen to us. We'd really appreciate that. If you feel like sustaining us with a one-off nod to say thanks on Ko-fi, please go to their website, which is ko-fi.com/history hack. Because seriously, even historians need, drinks at the pub, and we need to feed our pets. And gosh, I don't have enough books yet, so I'd really love it if you'd help me buy some more books. If you really, really like us and you want to be a patron supporter, we've actually changed the way our tiers are organized, and there's now lots of incentives and free content heading your way. For that, you want to go to www.patreon.com/history hack. Get a personal selfie with Chris. He'll do requests. Who knows? You might even get to meet up in a pub with us someday. Anyway, today we're going to be speaking with Ben Kay about women at Warwick Castle. Thank goodness. After weeks of World War II, we finally have a bit of medieval content. Hi, Ben. It's great to have you here today. I'm so looking forward to hearing about Warwick Castle and the amazing women there.
Happy to be here as well. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So, Ben, let's start off by saying, tell us a little bit about when the idea for this tour occurred and how it came together. I know my experience of visiting castles in the past. Despite my Yank accent, I have been lucky enough to spend time in England and have seen a number of castles. I have always found that the interpretation tends to be very much on the role of the castle in various battles and war, or the role of the castle in the life of significant men who have actually been the proprietors and so on. Tell us a bit about how this is different.
So you're absolutely right. Yeah, in a lot of castles, you do focus on those aspects: war, sieges, and we're no different at Warwick Castle. We have lots of exhibits here, and they focus on, for example, Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, Earl of Warwick during the Wars of the Roses. But about 5 or 6 years ago now, my predecessor, Melissa, wanted to come up with this new idea of putting a spotlight on stories that aren't often told at Warwick Castle. So we all got together. We thought, well, how can we do this? Let's look at these key figures in Warwick's history from the beginning of our story almost to the very modern day of our story. And we came up with these great figures that, that have a great part in not just Warwick's history, but in general English history as well. And some of these figures are well known amongst academics. Others are more local to us, with some surprises along the way. And it's focusing on what the public would like to listen to as well, because we have about 20 different tours we offer to the public here, focusing on different aspects of the history of the castle. We tend to pick tours depending on what the time of the month is, if there's special events going on, anniversaries, or just what this type of the crowd that's coming into the castle's like. Because during summertime, you get more families, for example. During the off-peak season, where it's much quieter on weekdays, we get a lot of people that want to learn more about the in-depth heritage. So it gives us a lot of leeway in how we tell our stories, not just through signage, but a lot of people get more out of it if you're in a room with somebody that knows the history and they can then ask questions, and they absorb it more. People leave the castle having learned something different, which is what we always aim for at Warwick Castle.
It sounds fascinating. I'm obviously going to be putting this on the next time I'm back in England on my list of visits. But tell us a little bit. I know that the site itself has a very long and significant history, although the fabric of the castle has been changed multiple times. Is it the daughter of Alfred the Great who is first recorded on the site?
So her name is, it depends who you ask, but sometimes you pronounce it Ethelflaed. In the Old Anglo-Saxon, Old English, it's Eathelflaed. And she, as you say, the daughter of King Alfred the Great. She was the first person to actually fortify our town. There's been a settlement in this area since Neolithic times, thousands of years ago, but the term Warwick didn't appear until the 900s. So at that time, England was being invaded and pillaged and raided by Danish Vikings. And by the end of the 800s, early 900s, England was mostly under Danish control. In fact, where Warwick Castle is now, we are in the heart of Mercia, a huge Anglo-Saxon kingdom. By the 900s, it was split in half. North was owned by the Danes, south was still in control of the Mercians, but under the ownership largely of the Kingdom of Wessex, so Alfred the Great. But it was up to his daughter, Athelflaed, when she married Athelred of Mercia. You could say they were a power couple. They had to try and stop the Danes from advancing south, and the idea was to stop them by fortifying the towns, villages along the way. In 911, Athelflaed's husband, Athelred, he died, and she became the sole leader of Mercia, and she was known as the Lady of Mercians. Her role then was to continue building these great forts, and she got to Warwick in 914. And Warwick was an integral part of the country, purely because we are smack bang in the centre of England for a start. We're built next to a large river, the Avon, which controls the centre of our nation. If you control a river, you can now control trade routes across the nation as well. And Warwick was also very close to an old Roman road called the Fosse Way, which connected the north, south of England, roads into Wales as well. So it was an ideal place to have a fortification. So she builds what's called an Anglo-Saxon burh. It's an earthen rampart with wooden walls and gates around the outside. Warwick being at the time a fairly small place, only about 1,000 people lived in Warwick. So it was a very small village, small settlement, but it was vital. And her works lasted for over 100 years, and it kept the Danes at bay for a long, long time, until 1016. And she also then carried on this idea of reconquesting or reconquering her stolen lands. She kicked the Danes out of much of Mercia. She took Leicestershire from them. Her biggest success was she took Derby from the Danes as well. And she even got the Vikings at York to surrender to her. Unfortunately, she died in 918 before the pen was put on paper. But her work was then continued by the other lords of Mercia, then the kings of Wessex afterwards. So you could say they followed in her footsteps of taking the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms back from the Danish invaders, and she did a brilliant job of it.
That is quite remarkable. Whenever I have read any history from that period, it has been the names of women have been significant by their absence. Mm-hmm. How unusual? I'm gonna guess we already know the answer, but how unusual was her role as leader at this point? Is she exceptional, or are there other warlike women leaders during this era who are fighting against the Danes and pushing them back?
Certainly for the Anglo-Saxon period, not many, because at that time they were very much a Christian-based population. It was led by men, so her role was quite unusual. It was, you could say, so unusual that after her death in 918, when the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles are being written, which is a great outline of Anglo-Saxon life in the 900s into the 1000s, unfortunately, Athelflaed was cut out of it completely. They didn't want to talk about her, and it's because of her brother Edward the Elder, who became King of Wessex. He thought, I can't have my sister taking all this glory, so he decides to start erasing her from history. Luckily, records did survive of her from other chronicles that weren't written by him. That's how we know a lot about her. But they did try and, you could say, erase her from history, which is a massive shame, because the impact she had. If it wasn't for her, Warwick would never have survived as a town, and without Warwick, there would be no Warwick Castle, and without Warwick Castle, there'd be no job for me. So I have a personal thanks for Athelflaed as well.
Oh, plus ça change.
Exactly.
Plus ça change. I do know there's another famous woman. It's quite a bit further on. So if we missed someone, let us know. But it seems that Gundrada de Varennes also plays a role, but perhaps not in quite the same positive way as Ethelflaed. I seem to remember she is tricked into surrendering the castle. Do I have that right? Tell us about that.
Yes, so that was during one of our sieges. So we've had 3 sieges at Warwick Castle: 1153, 1264, and then 1642. The first one in 1153 was during the Anarchy, a terrible civil war in our nation. King Stephen versus Empress Matilda, who was also, of course, a very powerful woman for her time, and then her son Henry of Anjou, who became Henry II. Now, at that time, England was in chaos, as the name suggests, the anarchy. Our owners at the time, the Earls of Warwick, were ordered to protect the nation's capital, ordered to protect London, and they were under the ownership of the de Newburgh family. Gundred, the wife of the Earl at the time, Roger, was told, "Well, you're in charge of the castle. I'm going to go to London with most of my army, protect the capital." She was given a small force, just a few guards, I suppose, to protect the actual castle itself, servants. No one expected Henry of Anjou to march to the Midlands, where we are now in Warwick. It was almost by surprise that he arrived, and she was tricked. She was told, "London's fallen. Your husband has been killed. There's no point in keeping the castle gate shut. You may as well let us in." And she thought, well, to spare the lives of the people in the castle and of Warwick, let them straight in. According to some stories, when her husband found out about it, he actually died of shock. It was again not the same sort of level as Athelflaed, but it shows how, especially when the Earl is away, it is down to the Countess. They run the administration of the castle. They're in charge. If there's any issues, people will go to them. And even when in times of siege, you'll find that it will be up to the Countess because they're there. They have to help lead the siege, not so much fighting, but do most of the tactics and work out who to put where, and if the castle has to surrender, it's up to them as well.
No, that's such an important point, that the women were involved in these such events. I mean, I think there are a few castles, as you were saying there, Ben, where there have been women, aristocratic women in medieval times, who have actually played quite an active role. I mean, I can't remember the site, but I think, is there a woman called Nicola de la Haye? I seem to have her connected with some kind of siege somewhere. And I think at Dover Castle, Eleanor de Montfort, Simon de Montfort's wife, was also involved when a siege was going on the castle. So it's, yeah, as you say, it's so important to actually kind of bring women into the picture in those events as well, because even if they weren't fighting, they were still living or visiting castles. They were still involved in that castle life.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, the role they played, especially in the Middle Ages, is often overlooked, I feel. And you get all these great warrior kings, Edward I, Edward III, Henry V, but when you look at their spouses and the lords and the countesses and duchesses around them, I mean, they played such a pivotal role in shaping the fabric of not just English but British history as well. Definitely.
Exactly. Now, the War of the Roses.
Mm-hmm.
As we know, there is a great deal of importance in terms of the castle and the prominence of various women. Also, tell us a little bit about that period of history.
It was a very complex time for our castle, because before the war started, the castle was in the hands of a very powerful family. They were called the de Beauchamp family. Funnily enough, we get actually quite a lot of Americans coming to the castle, American tourists, and they claim lineage to this one particular family, the de Beauchamps, which is not surprising. The de Beauchamps had a lot of children, and in fact, one of the Countesses of Warwick, called Catherine Mortimer, had 15 children, 9 of which survived to adulthood, which is pretty impressive for the time. So they spread around the entire nation and back into France, and they made their fortune not just by serving their kings, but by fighting for them in their wars against the Welsh, the Scottish, the French. In fact, the two main towers we have at the castle, both Guy's and Caesar's, were funded by the proceeds of the 100 Years' War against the French in the 14th century. We captured quite a lot of French nobility, knights, men of the church, men worth alive than dead, so you'd sell them back for ransom. And by the 1400s, this family were amongst the wealthiest in the entire nation. However, as with all these great families, you've got to make sure you keep the family line going. Normally, when Earl of Warwick dies, the eldest born son becomes the next Earl. However, the Beauchamps ran out of sons. Now, when it comes to earldoms, they are, as a middle ranking title, can pass through females. So the eldest daughter can inherit the castle, the land, even the title. However, the person she then marries would then take it from her. And this just happened in 1449. Sadly, Henry de Beauchamp, our Earl, passed away. He was the 14th Earl of Warwick, and when he died, he was only 21. He left behind a 2-year-old daughter called Anne, and as the sole inheritor, this 2-year-old inherited the entire Warwick estate and fortune. She then sadly passed away at the age of 5. We're not sure what killed her, but because infant mortality was so high back then, a disease, even the common cold, I imagine, could kill her. And that left almost like a power vacuum between the siblings of Henry de Beauchamp, the 14th Earl. His eldest sister, also called Anne de Beauchamp, she was the one that took the castle, the estate, and she was already married to Richard Neville. He was a very powerful northern lord up in Yorkshire. He owned Middleham Castle, and by combining the estates of Warwickshire and most of Yorkshire, this marriage meant that you could not walk across England without passing through some land controlled by Richard and his wife. It gave him a vast fortune, to the point where he was almost untouchable. And then the Wars of the Roses started. Warwick Castle's allegiances kept switching. At first, the de Beauchamps would have supported Henry VI, the King of England. In fact, Henry VI was partly raised by the de Beauchamp family when he was a child, an infant king. But Richard Neville had other ideas. He sided with the House of York, in particular Richard, the Duke of York, as he was a part of their family. He was one of their cousins. So he led our castle into this war, and it cost the castle a great deal. People have asked me, was Richard a good earl? In the long term, no. He cost us a huge amount of power. He squandered the money and power given to him by the marriage to Anne de Beauchamp. And I always feel sorry for Anne because she outlived almost everyone in her entire family. Her husband died. He was killed in 1471 at the Battle of Barnet. She watched her 2 daughters end up dying, both Isabel and Anne Neville. She then watched some of her grandchildren perish, not just in the fighting, but later on, killed after the war as well. She spent most of her time, actually, when the war had concluded, trying to fight to reclaim her lands in Warwickshire. She wanted to come back to Warwick Castle. Most of her time actually down south, near Bournemouth, and it's nowadays it's Beaulieu area, Beaulieu Abbey. Nowadays a motor museum, and she spent most of her time there, almost in exile, and fighting in Parliament, in the courts to get her lands back. And unfortunately, it was to no avail. She passed away in 1492, a very poor lady. So all that work that her family had done for nearly 200 years of Warwick Castle's history was undone by her just very greedy husband, some would say. So it cost her a great deal, and it's quite a sad story to think that she ended up with nothing just because of a war that cost our castle not just an earl, but it cost us a countess as well.
And also the fact that despite the fact that it's her land and her lineage, that the minute you're married, it isn't anymore.
Absolutely, yeah.
You
her property forfeit, yeah.
Yeah. So after the War of the Roses, when it's finally over and England returns to being a functional kingdom, maybe that's the best way to put it, because I'm not sure normal is something that that occurred after that catastrophic event. Tell us a little bit, who is the next important woman at Warwick?
So, funnily enough, I did mention it very briefly in that bit. It was Richard Neville's daughter. This is again during the war itself. During the you could say the more peaceful aspects of it. It wasn't constant fighting. It's 32 years, but it wasn't. There were breaks, like in the 100 Years' War, 116 years, but they took a break for the plague. Couldn't fight during them. So they Anne Neville. She's a very prominent figure. Quite popular these days, thanks to books written about this period of history. For example, The White Queen, Philippa Gregory's books, and of course when they discovered Richard III's body in Leicester back in 2012, books written about him and his life. And Anne Neville is a very, very unique figure in the sense that her father, Richard Neville, did try and use her for personal gain. He actually had her married to the Prince of Wales, Edward of Lancaster. Now, it wasn't a very good marriage because it wasn't to do with love. It was about trying to have Richard Neville's family, be connected to the royal family. It didn't last very long. Edward, Prince of Wales, died at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471. This left Anne Neville free to marry who she chooses, and normally your father would choose who to marry for you, but he's dead, so no problem there. And Anne actually married someone that she loved. In fact, they grew up together. They spent a lot of time together. It was Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. They knew each other from childhood, and it was very much a marriage of love. So she marries him in 1472. He's better known as King Richard III, of course. Because of this, she becomes Queen Consort. So, in a roundabout way, I suppose Richard Neville got what he wanted, his family on the throne of England. But he wasn't alive to see that happen. And Anne Neville and Richard III were going to bring a new era to our nation. And there's many arguments around Richard III, a very controversial king in English history. But Anne Neville was the person that always was beside him, and he did love her deeply. Anne Neville did give him a child who sadly passed away. Anne Neville died first before her husband, about 6 months earlier. Her death, some would say, is a mystery. Most common assertion is that Anne died of a sickness of some description. There are others that claim Anne may have been assassinated. Who assassinated her? According to plays of Shakespeare, for example, and all these Tudor propaganda pieces written, it was actually Richard himself that killed his own wife. Why he did this? Again, it's Tudor nonsense in my opinion. But he loved her deeply, and after her death, he was never quite the same again. He lost his child, he lost his wife, and then he would lose his country. To this very day, there's not many images you'll find of Anne Neville. You'll find a few bits of stained glass here and there of her as queen, and I believe there's a tapestry in Coventry where you'll see her as Queen of England, but no portraits, no paintings. A forgotten Queen Consort, some would say. But thanks to this renewed interest in the Wars of the Roses, thanks to the White Queen, thanks to the car park, another thing of Richard III, it has brought about new interest. And we here at Warwick Castle get it quite a lot because we were the home of Anne Neville. She was born at Warwick Castle. So it's the place. We get a lot of pilgrims for the Wars of Roses coming here, saying we want to be in the same place that Anne Neville once stood herself. And we can point out bits of the castle today that she would have been in. The towers and walls were there. She would have walked them. Some of the rooms in the Undercroft are exactly the same as they were since her day. There's also a room in the castle which would have been more than likely the bedroom of the Earl and Countess of Warwick. That's nowadays where our green drawing room is, a 17th century stateroom. But behind the walls, there are a couple of doors, and we have some secret passageways and whatnot down there, staircases, and that's what's left of these old bedrooms. And we let people, depending on how many there are, like VIP tours, for example, into these rooms so they can actually be in the same place that these people were. And Warwick Castle, thanks to this marriage, became a great centre of power. In fact, Anne and Richard had this idea in their heads to transform Warwick Castle into a brand new royal palace. Their work didn't get very far, unfortunately. They did finish two very small and unimpressive towers called both Bear and Clarence Tower, but they never got to finish their overall project, which was to create a brand new inner keep and inner fortress in our central courtyard. Because the reign of Richard and Anne was only 2 years long, there was just no time to finish it. So they were the last remnants of the Wars of the Roses. And after Anne's death, that's when really nothing was the same ever again. The power of Warwick Castle had vanished. When Richard III died, that power just evaporates. And then after the war, the Tudors take it. Warwick Castle's lands were divided. They were sold off. Some were in crown ownership. Others were given away to, for example, the Earls of Leicester. So Warwick Castle was just a building abandoned. The Tudors, when they won the war, to them, a building like Warwick Castle is a reminder of the Wars of the Roses, of the Yorkists, of a piece of history that they don't like, a piece of history that can affect their reign. So for decades, no one lived at Warwick Castle. We left to rot and crumble. Luckily, the main structure survived. We're one of the most intact castles to this very day because of it. Thankfully, the Tudors didn't knock us down like they did their monasteries. So because of that, we're still here. And we still stand as a reminder of not just the war, but of people like Anne, like Richard, these lives that once at Warwick Castle. And you can still feel they're there. Some people say to me they can still feel them there today, echoing the halls. Because the castle still feels like a very much lived in place today.
Fascinated that there are material remains. So as you were saying, you can walk in some of the same places, you can enter some of the same rooms. As someone who, while a historian is a historian primarily of buildings and their connections to people in society. I think I've always found that very compelling, and I'm sure people who take the tour do as well. To have that moment of standing in a place where someone that you've learned about, someone who was incredibly important, is someone who was a pivotal figure in in history, and to actually occupy the same physical area, even though you're not in the same time, must be a marvelous and remarkable experience.
Absolutely, yeah, I think so. We get a lot of people say the same thing. It's all well and good going to a castle ruin, where you have to imagine what's going on. But I suppose with us, we are unique in the sense that you can be in an actual room, and the history's still there. The stories are still told, and thankfully, they'll still be here for, I imagine, many more centuries to come.
Now, you mentioned the green room. And so from that comment, I know that while the castle had been abandoned during the Tudor period, and an excellent point that you made about, because castles are a physical symbol of power, if you have taken over that power, that site, then if you can't immediately repurpose it and use it as a symbol of your own power, you're better just to let it rot, because that indicates your triumph over the power that was there. But Warwick Castle comes back into use, doesn't it, after this period? Tell us a little bit about what happens next, and some of the women who were involved in the next stage of history.
So the castle saw a new lease of life in the early 17th century. It was eventually it was a wreck by the year 1603, when Elizabeth I passed away, and then King James VI of Scotland became James I of England, and he was told, "You've got a castle in Warwick. No one's lived there for a long time. It's only worth £470, which is not much money. Do you want to renovate it or knock it down?" And he said, "Well, I could knock it down, but then again, King James was not that popular amongst some English aristocrats. To make friends, you give them things, presents, bribes, some would say." There was one particular person in London he was quite eager to please, and that was a man called Sir Fulk Greville. Sir Fulk was a key figure in the court of Elizabeth I. He was Treasurer of the Navy. He became the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he was a very, very loose relation to the de Beauchamps. So the king said, "Do you want Warwick Castle?" And Fulk Greville said, "You know what? I'll take it from your hands." He would then spend millions of pounds in today's money in restoring the castle back to its former glory. And the Greville family are the longest serving family to ever live at Warwick Castle. They lived at the castle for close to 400 years, from 1604 till 1978. The Grevilles gave to us better grounds, better gardens, more modern interiors. They transformed the castle into what's known as a stately home. But we have a stately home built inside a medieval castle, which makes it quite unique, I suppose. However, the idea was to transform it into a more luxurious place that's relaxing and not so much a formidable fortress. However, in the 1640s, the Civil War breaks out, and for the very last time, Warwick Castle was used as an actual fortress. We supported Parliament, which is quite unusual. Many castles supported the Royalists. You can tell because they're ruins. They were simply destroyed in the fighting. But we are a parliamentarian castle, and the reason being is because the Greville family in the early to mid-1600s were very strict Christians. They were Puritan, very much like Oliver Cromwell was. Because of this, they did not like the fact that King Charles I had married a French Catholic. It caused a rift between the Grevilles of Warwick and, of course, the king, and we chose Parliament. Oddly enough, though, there was one person at Warwick Castle that didn't share that same sentiment, and it was a lady called her name. She was the wife of Robert Greville. Her name escapes me. I can't remember her name at all. They'll come back to me in a second, I imagine. But the wife of Robert, this time there was no earl, there was barons. We didn't have earls until the 1700s. Catherine Russell, that's it. So her name was Catherine Russell. She was from Woburn Abbey, very powerful family, the Bedford family. Now, she was nothing like her husband. She was not a Puritan, although she probably claimed to be. She preferred the finer things in life: throwing parties, drinking alcohol, wearing bright-coloured clothes, things that Puritans despised. Now, her husband banned all this. In fact, her husband took long pikes and destroyed the stained glass windows in St Mary's Church, our town centre, because they were Catholic idols. He had the idea of banning Christmas, as Puritans didn't like the idea of celebrating Christmas in the old way because it was too frivolous, people getting drunk. So they banned that. He banned bright clothing, banned drinking. He tried to really suck the fun out of our town. I would say, luckily, he didn't last very long into the war. Robert Greville, the Baron Brooke, he died in 1643. He was killed at the Siege of Lichfield, about 40 miles north of where we are now. He was shot through the eye by a sharpshooter atop the cathedral. When news reached Warwick Castle of his death, Catherine didn't seem to care very much at all because, well, she didn't like her husband. And in fact, there's no portraits actually of her husband done when he was alive. More than likely, she destroyed them all. The only portrait we have of him was done about 30 years after his death by one of his sons. In the meantime, Catherine Russell, what she did, she gathered her children, her 3 sons, and moved out of Warwick Castle. She gave the castle on loan to Parliament and to Oliver Cromwell to use as a base to gather soldiers, supplies, ammunition, and we were used as a prison as well for a time, housing more important royalist prisoners. In the meantime, Catherine Russell goes to London. They had a house there in Holborn, sadly, but it was destroyed in the late 1600s during the Great Fire of London. But this house was quite a large house for London standards, and it had a lovely garden. And it's believed that Catherine Russell is now credited to be one of the first people in London to cultivate oranges in their back garden, a very expensive fruit for the time. She hosted grand parties, and she wanted to make sure that her family got on the good side of the kings of England. And in 1660, Charles II, he returned to England. However, Catherine would actually order one of her sons, also called Robert, to go to France, and she told him, apologise to the king. He was one of 6 noble peers to bring King Charles II home. And by doing that, Catherine has very cleverly saved her family's estates. They moved back into Warwick Castle. They kept their home, they kept their lands, they kept their titles and their money. And her vision is still felt today, because when you walk into the Green Drawing Room in particular at the castle, when you look around, even though we were a parliamentarian castle, you'll find no portraits of parliamentarians. You'll find portraits of royalists and kings and queens instead. A physical way of saying sorry. And it worked. So thanks to her, ingenuity and the fact she didn't, abide by her husband's ideals, she saved our castle. Because if she hadn't have done that, Charles II, he was out for vengeance. I mean, there's actually an interesting, looks like an interesting docudrama coming out actually recently on Sky about the King's Kill List and how he punished people for the part they played against his father in the war. If Catherine hadn't done that, we could have lost the Greville family, and in doing so, that we could have lost the castle, and we wouldn't be here today.
I'm fascinated that she was able to loan everything to the parliamentarians and step away, and yet through her living in London, through her sending her son over as an emissary, managed to sort of keep everybody happy. She must have been astonishingly intelligent and very savvy woman as far as understanding power and how it worked in order to keep these 2 catastrophically warring sides and somehow not get caught or punished by either. Quite intriguing.
She definitely flew under the radar, I think, for the most part. I mean, it's about saving what you have, and I think Catherine was definitely one of those people that almost could see the future. Would our nation work under Parliament? And as history tells us, it didn't, because Oliver Cromwell's ideal of a republic and him being Lord Protector, it worked when he was in charge, but as soon as he was gone, it just fell apart. And she saw the writing on the wall. She knew full well what was going to happen. There was cries, restore monarchy, and she jumped on that wagon straight away and thought, brilliant, I need to get in there and make sure that my voice is now heard and my family's voice is heard. And then by doing so, she saved not just her family's future, but Warwick's future.
Sounds like she was greatly underestimated by the gentlemen in power at the time.
Oh, I think so. Puritans, the Puritan faith didn't really have much space for women, especially when they fled, of course, across the ocean to America, and the Salem witch trials and all this. But the Puritan faith was certainly a bleak time, some would say, for British history. Their rules and ideals were very much I say medieval, and people say, "Oh, the Dark Ages was the medieval period." Well, actually, I'd say the 17th century was much worse for regular people, not just women but men as well. It was a horrible time. You got the witch craze going across England, where hundreds were killed as witches. You had persecutions of people that were slightly different faith to you. You could be a Christian, but you might worship in a different way. That's it. You're a heretic. It was a very dark time. So for someone like Catherine to be almost like a light in the darkness for Warwick Castle, she's definitely one of our, I often call her the unsung hero of Warwick Castle.
Definitely. No, she's a fascinating figure just from what we've heard from you there, Ben. And our next woman is called Maria Hume. Can you tell us a little bit about which era Maria lived in, and a bit more about her role and personality?
Absolutely. Maria she was a servant. So when you come to castles, you hear lots of stories about the earls and the countesses and the battles and sieges. But to run a castle, you need a small army of servants. Maria was one of them. Maria worked at the castle from the mid to late 1700s until her death in the early 1800s, and she was a remarkable lady because she spent 58 years serving the family. She was 95 when she died, which she died in 1834. So getting to that age of 95 is incredible for that sort of period of history. And her entire life was dedicated to Warwick Castle and serving the Greville family. She had no real family of her own. In fact, many servants didn't. Most servants that came to work at Warwick Castle weren't married, and many chose not to marry, because often in some houses, if you married and had children, you'd have to leave servitude because your focus is now on your family as opposed to the Grevilles. Whereas Maria, she wanted to be a part of their world. She raised many of the Earl of Warwick's children to the point where they viewed her not just as a servant, they viewed her as a member of their family. She became the highest ranking female member of staff. That rank would be the head housekeeper, one of the few servants that were allowed to answer back to the Earl and Countess of Warwick at the time. Not only that, she also raised a lot of money for the castle because at this time in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the castle was suffering huge debt problems because the Grevilles, they liked to throw their parties. They liked having gold on their ceilings and their walls. They liked buying fine things and traveling the world. So debts were on the increase. In fact, in the year 1803, at the time, George Greville, the second Earl of the family name, George was in debt of £13 million in today's money. He was forced to sell off parts of his own collection to fund his lavish lifestyle. In fact, it got to the point where his own wife, Henrietta Vernon, got so sick of him that she actually locked him out the castle for 2 weeks because he was spending all of her money as well. So Maria took it upon herself to help the family. She did what she could. She wasn't just a servant. The castle was opened to the public for the first time in 1815 to raise some extra funds. And she was actually one of the very first ever tour guides. She would take people on tours around the castle and tell all the great history and the stories we have. And these people that were invited to visit the castle back then weren't just people from the streets. These were very, very prestigious people. Other earls, dukes, barons, celebrities from around the world had come to Warwick Castle. And Maria gave them tours. And of course, because they're such wealthy people, they tipped very, very well. In the entire time Maria Hume had worked at Warwick Castle, she amassed savings of £30,000. But in today's money, that's £2.4 million. Now, whether all that money was from tips, that's up for debate. There's some people that say perhaps some of that money was actually not hers. It was part of the Earl's, just in her account, resting for a rainy day. Either way, all the money she had, before she died, she gave it to the family. As a way of saying, I love this place so much, please don't sell any more items. She loved the artwork collection of Warwick Castle. By donating that £2.4 million of today's money back to the family, she saved their collection. To say thank you to her, she is now buried pretty much next door to the family in St Mary's Church in their crypt. So she was buried as one of them. So it goes to show that the life of a servant wasn't horror stories that some houses have where the servants are beaten and mistreated, but actually Maria was someone that grew so close to the family. She became not just a friend, but I suppose a mother figure to men like George Greville, and then later on his son, Henry Greville, the third Earl. And her generosity kept our collection intact. It's a collection that we still have to this very day.
That's so fascinating. And I think from those women we've heard about so far, I mean, it seems to be, I don't know if you think so as well, Nina, but I mean, it's the women on various occasions who have been saving the castle, saving collections. Like, they've had such important roles, clearly.
I agree. These are fascinating stories, Ben, and I'm so glad that you and the rest of the history and interpretation folks are committed to this and have put this into sort of made it a significant part of the aspect of how the castle is interpreted, so that people can learn and understand the role of women at Warwick Castle, but hopefully open their minds to taking a deeper look at history in general, during the lengthy period that Warwick Castle is a significant factor in the history of the nation, and start to understand the complexities and the large role that so many women did play. And I'm harking back to Rita's brother, who decided, hang on a minute, this is a woman, so I'm going to sort of, I'm going to kind of airbrush her. Of course, that didn't exist then. That's quite an anachronism. But I'm going to not talk about her in the Chronicles because, this isn't how it works. Men are important. Men are running things, and so I've got to find a way. She, in a sense, the fact that she did these things must make her unwomanly, and so we're not actually going to make that part of history. So when people do come to visit you, do they need to schedule this tour ahead of time? Can you just arrive to visit Warwick Castle and ask for this particular tour? I'm sure that our listeners are going to want more information about how to actually participate and make sure that they get to do this.
Absolutely. So when you come to the castle, we have a tour board, and we update the tour board every single day, and we pick and choose what tours we want to do for that set day, whether it's anniversary or something special happening for the month or the day, for example. But we do take requests, and quite a lot of the stories I've told you actually do focus on our other tours. For example, Maria Hume's story, I do tell that story on certainly my tours. Some of the others do as well, just in day-to-day talks. But the Women at Warwick tour is one where we put everything together to make it more cohesive and follow that set narrative. But you will find aspects of these stories no matter where you go. In fact, we have got an exhibition, a permanent exhibition set up here on the house side of the castle called the Royal Weekend Party. And that entire exhibit focuses on one particular event in Warwick Castle's history in 1898. It was a party thrown there by Countess Daisy, who herself was an amazing woman. Daisy's life is you could spend hours talking about Daisy. There's books written about her. Daisy threw grand parties. She was said to be the greatest socialite in the Victorian age. She had affairs and scandals. She was a socialist as well. And you can learn that by just simply walking around the rooms of Warwick Castle. We have wax figures done by Madame Tussauds of Daisy and some of these figures. So you can actually physically be in the same room as these people, which is incredible.
Fantastic. Well, this has been, Ben, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful, wonderful time with you. I know that our listeners are going to deeply appreciate it. I know I thoroughly enjoyed this. And as someone who does spend certainly a fair bit of time thinking about not only buildings, but actually thinking about the role of women in buildings, I am no joke at all, as we say over here, absolutely adding Warwick Castle to my to-do list when I'm over in the summer. And I'm looking forward to visiting and also to hearing more about the tremendous list of significant and fascinating women and their role there.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to welcoming you. I mean, anyone's welcome to visit Warwick Castle. We're open all year round apart from Christmas Day, and we close for only 2 weeks in January. And other than that, we're open all season.
Fantastic. Beth, anything else that did I miss anything in my brief finish there that you want to add before we release Ben back to all the things that I know he has to do today, in addition to spending so much wonderful time with us?
I think you covered a great deal there. It's been really interesting hearing about all of these women and showcasing women from different eras of the castle's history and how they shaped the castle and its life. Yeah, it's been really interesting. I just wanted to ask, Ben, when people are in the castle, I know you've mentioned the wax figures, you've mentioned the paintings. Is there any other items connected to any of these women or any other women that we haven't had a chance to talk about today, who visitors can see?
So, in terms of the medieval ones talked about, unfortunately, no. Finding medieval items is quite tough these days, and because the castle had changed so much over the years, it doesn't retain a lot of the medieval items, just the architecture. However, you will find items relating to Daisy, for example, who looked after the castle in the Victorian period, and we still have the rooms laid out in the exact same way. For example, we do offer certain behind-the-scenes tours where we can take guests behind closed doors, and you can actually see the rooms where people like Maria would have slept, and the servant bells that would have woke her up every morning. They're still there, attached this very day. So there's remnants of it all still there as a living castle.
Wonderful. No, thank you very much, Ben, for joining us. And as Nina said, I'm sure our listeners, they love a bit of medieval history. I'm sure we have many castle visitors among them as well. So I'm sure they very much have enjoyed this too. So thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, till next time, thanks again for listening. If you like us, don't forget, 5-star reviews on Apple cost nothing, and they get us seen. So we really appreciate them, just massively. Don't forget, we've got a brand new website, www.historyhack.co.uk. And there, again, you'll find bios, info, and the fantastic History Hack merchandise designed by our favorite beardy weirdy cartoonist. Hey, listen, you can buy us a drink on Ko-fi. Again, ko-fi.com/historyhack. And listen, historians need drinks. We need coffee, we need beer, we need cocktails. We'd love it if you'd do that for us. Finally, you could become one of our absolute all-time favorite people and subscribe regularly. We'd love this. www.patreon.com/historyhack. And listen, I heard you can get a lock of Chris's hair for doing this. All right, this Yank historian is off for further adventures in various totally nerdy topics, which you may or may not get to hear on future episodes of History Hack. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening.